chapter 4, verse 1. The Apostle Paul is kind of shifting gears. He in the latter part of the 3rd chapter, he talks about the wisdom of the world and how it's foolishness with God, and the latter part of what we studied the last time we were together. But whenever we get to chapter 4, let's just read verses 1 and 2. Paul wrote, "Let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful." Now, in Acts chapter 1, verses 21 and 22, many have believed, and I suppose may have even in the days of Corinth, that there was a criteria for being an apostle. In other words, you had to meet a certain standard or you couldn't be an apostle. So in Acts the 1st chapter, when they went to replace Judas, Peter was leading them and speaking, and they said that the person replacing Judas must be a disciple during Jesus' earthly ministry. That's a must. He must be an eyewitness of the resurrection. And he must be called and commissioned directly by Jesus Christ himself. That was a criteria for an apostle, or not necessarily an apostle, but for replacing Judas. Now, here's the thing. The Apostle Paul wasn't with Jesus' ministry from the beginning. And he wasn't an eyewitness to Jesus' resurrection. Oh, he could have been, but as far as we know, he wasn't. We do know that he was called and commissioned directly by Christ. Now, here's what was happening, I believe. In the church at Corinth, we had people there that were educated people on the gospel, and you have to bear in mind that the book of Acts has not been written. In fact, it was written by Luke, who was a follower of Paul. So just because someone believes that this is the criteria for being an apostle doesn't necessarily mean that it is. It is very possible, and it may be even likely, that they thought that Paul did not meet the standards set forth in Acts chapter 1 because he was an apostle. He refers to himself that was called after the time. But here's the thing. He was an apostle. Not because of meeting some standard, but because of Jesus working through him. And it's pretty obvious. If you just look at the life of the Apostle Paul and what was happening in his life, that God touched that man in a way which is not ordinary. In fact, he was inspired to write most of the New Testament. Now, if you throw out his apostleship, you just throwed away about half of the New Testament. Just food for thought. But there were those who were not Paul fans. In fact, they did not believe that he met the standard for an apostle. And that's what he's actually addressing in the chapter 4, is he has come under fire, and they are questioning his apostleship. And if they can, and here's the thing, if they can downplay or disregard his apostleship, that means that he's not in a position of authority to lead or correct. You can throw that out the window. So it's a very serious issue that he's confronting. And notice in the 4th chapter, Paul asks that he and the other apostles be considered servants. He's not asking for some high position. He's saying, consider us a servant. Paul actually had a real problem with the Corinthians because they kindly looked down on his apostleship and they did not respect his apostolic authority. Now there's a difference. If we go to correct a member, we have to do it through majority vote. That's the standard by which Jesus set up. But an apostle doesn't have to have the church permission. He goes directly in, and you'll find it later on as we get into the book of Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, in fact, the next chapter. There was actually a lady and her stepson that was attending the church at Corinth that was a widow. She was a widow, her husband died, and her stepson were having an affair together. And Paul said, I have judged in the matter already. In other words, you don't have to take this before the church. I've already established this was not right and it's wrong. And anyway, he has that authority to say whether something's wrong or right. And that's very important, because as we read and study in the Word of God, we think, well, they've got the Word of God and they can just pull it open and see. But the New Testament has not yet been written. So they are going by the word of mouth. And that's a big thing. Because believe it or not, even in this time period, there were a lot of people professing to be something they were not. And it was a big problem. So the Apostle Paul is attempting to teach the Corinthians about proper amount of respect and honor that they should have for him and that they should have for the other apostles. You can't respect a person too much. You believe that? You can put a person up so high on a pedestal, and because of their humanity, they will fall off eventually. And when they fall off, it can be very devastating to you. So you can actually esteem a person too much. But you can also esteem a person too little. And it's just as damaging. So Paul is trying to put them somewhere in the middle. In verse 2, he uses a Greek word which actually describes the function of a free man, which is under a type of master. And it actually refers to an under rower in the ship. In other words, there was men, because they didn't have anything to power a boat other than the wind and sails. If the wind wasn't blowing, they used the paddle, the old oar, as we would call it, boat oar. So they had men that would get down in the belly of the ship and sit on benches, wooden benches, and have a 30-foot oar. Can you imagine an oar being about 30 feet long? And they would actually pedal that big old ship. And there would be a lot of them. Now here's the thing. Paul is using this to describe the function of this servant. If you are one of those rowers, you have to be in perfect harmony with those around you. Because when they stretch back, you're going to have to stretch back too. And to not be in harmony is going to be complete chaos. Not only that, you work together from side to side. So if one side is rowing faster than the other, what happens? The ship goes to turning. So they have to be in perfect unison. So he's using this to describe this type of position, this servant. It's not the lowest position of a servant, but it's certainly not the highest either. And the under rower is pledged to service, and he's one that acts under direction, and he doesn't ask questions. Can you imagine propelling the ship and somebody says, oh, wait a minute, I got a question. No, the whole thing would just go bad. So he just acts, and he doesn't ask questions. These had their workstation in the belly of the ship, and they had to work in harmony. To get out of time, of course, would purposely hesitate, or would cause the whole process of propelling the ship to fail. They're the ones that do what they're appointed to do without hesitation, and one that reports only to the one that is over them. And I'm sure Harry could fill us in on a lot more than I can for his history, but I understand in some cases there was a drummer up there that kept time. And whenever he hit the drum, they knew that was the time it was supposed to move and grab another piece of that water and propel the ship. But Paul describes these rowers as they serve under Christ, the master pilot. In other words, he's the one up there telling them to keep rhythm, keep it going, and to move forward the ship. As it was written, under the rowers served Christ the master pilot, helping to move forward the ship of the church toward the haven of heaven. So there's a difference in between a steward and a slave. A steward is actually a manager of the slaves, and that's kind of where Paul puts himself. Paul regards us as servants to Jesus, but even the steward was a slave. Even just one given a position of leadership. In relation to other slaves, he was kind of like the one that told them what to do. Clark said the steward was a master's deputy in regulating the concerns of the family, providing food for the household, seeing that it served at the proper time and seasons, and in proper amounts. In other words, he's like an overseer. Paul stated that he and the apostles were stewards of the mysteries of God. So this means that Paul and the other disciples were to manage in the household of God. They managed in the sense of preserving, protecting, dispensing, and distributing the truth of God. So when Paul would hear criticism about his style or about the manner in which he delivered his speech, he had asked a simple question: did I give you the truth? And of course they would have to say yes, and that was his primary concern. How many times have you heard somebody say, well, I know they don't like it, but I don't really care? I bet you said that a time or two. The Apostle Paul found himself kind of in that position. He's an apostle, which means he is a steward of the mysteries of God, and he's opposed here and there. And basically the statement he's making to the Corinthians is, they oppose me, but that's not my primary concern. My primary concern is giving them the truth. And in the latter part of verse 2, he says, and it's required in stewards that one be found faithful. Faithfulness was a primary responsibility of a steward. And it's not a lot different today. If you own a business and you hire an individual to lead that business for you, that person needs to be faithful. They need to be trustworthy. They need to be someone that you don't have to worry about. And that's the same thing with a steward of God. They have one of the greatest treasures ever known that they're dividing among people about the kingdom of heaven as taught by Jesus Christ. So they have an important job. So they need to be found faithful. A steward, another thing you might not have considered, a steward never owned any property or the resources that he dealt with. He simply managed it for his master and was expected to manage it faithfully. It wasn't his. It belonged to somebody else. And verses 3 through 5, but with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by a human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. For I know of nothing against myself, yet I am justified by this, but he who judges me is the Lord. Therefore judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsels of the hearts. Then each one's praise will come from God. In other words, Paul is saying it's a very small thing that I'm judged by you. Now remember, he's an apostle. He's not an ordinary person. He's an apostle and he has apostolic authority. So he's not worried about what people think about him. Now, what happens if we get that attitude? Well, I don't care what they think. Can or should a Christian today have that same attitude? With little or no regard for what others think? What do you think? All right, very good. Janet was saying, confirm your belief, but don't be obnoxious about it. And that's very true. You have to remember that we're not apostles. We're just normal, everyday servants of God. So if the Corinthians claimed that Paul had no right to judge them, they could also claim that they don't have to obey him. And they'll wait for God's judgment. Now, if the Corinthians, with all the problems they're facing in the Corinthian church, and we just scratched the surface, there's a bunch of them. If the Corinthians do not take heed to what Paul is saying, if they doubt his authority to question or to correct them, then those problems are going to continue. And if those problems continue, then it may end up like Revelation's the first chapter where he says, I will remove your candlestick. In other words, I'll take that church away. Because every church, regardless of how long you've been a member there or how long it's been in business, every church needs some type of leader. You don't have to even be a good leader, but they need a leader. And the reason they need a leader is because without a leader, Satan has a field day. And this is a danger with a church which is without a pastor. Because they don't have an appointed leader, Satan can just tear it all to pieces. Because things aren't addressed and they're let go. And nobody believes that anybody else has the authority to correct or to change. And it just continues on until it becomes a nightmare. So leaders have their place. And Paul has every right to correct. And he's reminded them that God has appointed him to this position and that he's like a father to them. He's not there. And that's the thing. Usually whenever you have a matter that comes up, regardless of who's dealing with it, me or anyone else, usually when you confront a problem, it's like somebody is personally attacking you, particularly if you're the one that needs addressing. So when that happens, people often get the idea, well, you just want to beat me up. Why are you picking on me? But Paul is telling them, I'm like a father to you people. I love you and I care about you, and this is not to punish you. This is to correct you. Now, in other words, you're going in a direction which is not good, and all I'm doing is like the goad. I'm kind of touching you with that sharp point, leading you in another direction which is more in tune with Jesus Christ. So he wants them to understand that. And he tells them, I don't even judge myself. A lot of times my kids would start fighting or they'd be doing something they shouldn't be doing. And I use this a couple of times, particularly if they say, well, Danny, that's too harsh. In other words, that's too much punishment. And I would sometimes pull them to the side and I said, you decide the punishment for yourself. You tell me what would be a good punishment for that act that you just did. And sometimes they would come up with some little old something, it just didn't amount to anything. But more times than not, they would come up with far worse than what I would ever dream of. And that's people in general. When they start judging themselves, either they'll be too light on themselves, or in most cases, they're way too hard. So Paul is saying, I don't even judge myself. I'll leave that up to the Lord. And I'm very, very glad, and I don't mean it personally, I'm not implying to you in any way, but I'm very glad God is going to judge me and not mankind. Because I know God will judge me fairly. Whereas sometimes all of us have been guilty of not really having our facts straight and I wouldn't, you know what I'm talking about. Basically what Paul is telling them, and this is a hard pill to swallow. I can imagine I'm a church member sitting out there and Paul is telling me this. And basically, in his own words, he's basically saying, I have the authority to judge you, but you don't have the authority to judge me. if I was a church member, I would get my feathers ruffled a little bit about that conversation, I think. So, but he's saying it because there is a need to say it. He understands without understanding his authority, he can't correct. So it's very serious. So I know nothing against myself, yet I am not justified by this. In other words, Paul is telling them without any doubt that all of his righteousness comes from Jesus. He's not standing up saying, I'm this perfect guy. No, he's saying, I'm a sinner just like you. And all of my righteousness comes from Jesus. It's not from his personal life, although he did have a godly walk with Jesus. And he's warning them, don't judge before the time. And I caution you not to ever do that either. One of the saddest testimonies I received from a guy I worked with, he was attending a vacation Bible school, and they had laid out for quite some time, wasn't attending, and they got a visit from a member of that church, and they went and confronted his sister. Didn't confront him. He said, but in the conversation, they told his little sister, if you don't start going to church, you're going to hell. And that might have been a true statement, but it was not said right. And I know that Paul is saying to these people, not only do you not have the right to judge me, you don't have the right to judge me before the time. And what he's implying, imagine you have judges on the sideline and you're running a race. You know, all the runners are gathered together and they're running, and these judges say, before the race ever starts, they say, well, this guy's a winner. And all the rest of you are losers. You hadn't even run the race yet. And basically that's what Paul is saying. So you guys are skipping all the way to the end and you're judging me and already condemning me, but we hadn't even run the race yet. So basically he is implying that they're out of line. And he's saying that Jesus is the only judge, and he brings to light things, hidden things of darkness, and reveals the counsel of men's hearts. One reason I'm glad I'll be judged by God is because there won't be any mistakes. He looks on the heart. And a lot of things I might do that you might think are wrong, but the motives of my heart are good. The Lord will take the motives of my heart into consideration, whereas people probably wouldn't. Each one's praise will come from God. Paul understood that he might receive little praise from the Corinthian believers, but that really wasn't his main priority. His main priority was he knew there was coming a day when he would receive the praise of God, and that would mean far more than the praise of any man. So, any comment? Yes, that's very true, Miss Janet. Yes, he did. Yeah, you're exactly right. He had definitely proven his calling over and over and over through his faithfulness and what he endured, what he went through. Even the miracles that were performed by his hands.
Going back to, was he chosen, was he an apostle or chosen? If you go back to Acts chapter 1, when they chosen Matthias to replace Judas.
Yeah.
But then, you talked about Jesus appointed each one. He appointed Judas Matthias by lot. But when
Yeah.
he talked personally to Saul, before he became Paul, and he's the one that appointed Paul.
Very good. That's true. That's very true. And that's exactly what happened. Jesus called him directly, and even trained him to.
I know he was blind at the time when Jesus was talking to him, but Jesus himself, in fact, if you have a red letter edition, it says that Jesus was talking to him and appointed him as an apostle to the Gentiles.
Yes, very true, Sam, and very good point. Jesus called him directly, and I believe Jesus is still doing that. I mean, I think he's still calling men, and they're called to lead in many different directions, men and women for that matter. I think the Lord can call a lady to a special ministry. I believe that with all my heart. And I think he's still calling men. But how do we determine their calling? I mean, and that's a good question. We're at that point. And because we're dealing with this in this 4th chapter, how do you determine whether a person has been legitimately called by the Lord? Whether they're a minister, whether they're working in some other type of ministry, how do you know?
You can't jump the gun until the race is over, so you don't know the outcome of everything.
Yeah, you're very right. You can't just run to the end and say, well, yeah, they said they were called and that's all good. Because sometimes we know that's not good, because their calling is not what it should be. I don't doubt their calling, but it's not what it should be. So then again, we get back to the question, how do you know in your heart and that their calling is as thus saith the Lord, or the Lord actually called them to a position? All right, very good. Through their labors. They earn that trust over a process of time. And you watch their life, you watch their ministry, you watch their sacrifices, you see what they do, you see how they act. And if it does not reflect Jesus in a big way, then certainly you should call their calling into question. Not that they weren't called, just that they're not where they need to be with the Lord. And that's true of anybody. And that Paul's not asking them to just take him out of the blue and say, well, hey, yeah, I'm this guy and you've got to do what I say. He has done more than that. As Sam was saying, he walked the walk. He didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. And he proved that his apostolic authority was there. And obviously the Corinthians, for the most part, agreed with him because they accepted his counsel. So in verse 6, now these things, brethren, I have figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos for your sakes, that you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up on behalf of one against the other. And what he's, just like we kind of discussed, kind of got ahead of myself, but Paul is saying you need to judge by the word, judge the right way. Don't think beyond what is written. Paul wants the Corinthians to keep their learning and their thinking biblical. Don't use standards that are beyond God's word to judge him and the other apostles. And I encourage you to do the same. And first thing I think is so important with everybody, when you evaluate a person, regardless of whether that's a lady speaker or a gentleman, a lot of times we do this very unfairly. I love to laugh. And some people are born comedians. I mean, they are just very good at it. Everything that comes out of their mouth is witty and it's funny. And I enjoy listening to them. I do. But when it comes to the Word of God, I think there has to be a blend and a mix. And it shouldn't be just all about humor and all about laughing, because it's serious. So humor is not really a good quality to judge a person's calling. Neither is their entertainment value. And believe you me, the biggest problem ministry has, I don't know whether you thought about it or not, is people are entertained, and they love to be entertained. So do I. And we fill our lives with entertainment 24/7. And I'll put it to the test when you get home, and this happens at my house, and I'm pretty sure it does with yours too. If you go home and you get a little bit bored, you're going to grab a book, you're going to turn on the TV, you're going to turn on the radio, you're going to have some type of entertainment coming at you to break your boredom. Now imagine, if you would, someone who has to entertain you at least twice a week here and keep you awake, be humorous, cause you to laugh every now and then, and think of how difficult of a job that is. And back in 1920, here in probably East Texas, and I'm sure I'm telling you the truth, church houses were packed. But do you want to know a real reason why? The people were bored. There is no TV, there is no radio, there is no sports. There is nothing to entertain them, so they went to the house of God so they could be with their friends and hear this guy get up there and scream about God. And God used it in a big way. I'm not knocking it at all. But I'm just telling you the differences in ministry and how it's changed from year to year and how difficult it's become. And I've actually had people tell me, well, I come to church, but that's when the football game's on. And used to, on Saturday afternoon, not Sunday afternoon, that's when Disney come on. When they had their little program whenever I was a kid. Church started at 6, and guess what time Disney came on? 6 o'clock. And every good show that I wanted to see seemed to be right whenever I was supposed to be in church. Well, that's not a coincidence. Paul is a great man. He is a great minister. He is a great evangelist. He is behind Jesus. He's probably the top of pops as far as I'm concerned. But he himself had people who doubted his ministry. He himself had people who opposed him. Everywhere he went. You're right, Sam. And plumb to death even. I mean, they tried to kill him on more than one occasion. I'm sorry, Miss Janet. He was firm and faithful. You're right. He sure was. But Paul is warning these folks, and basically, I think his counsel is wrapped up. They had the Old Testament, and they read and studied it all the time. And he's not trying to take anything out of the Old Testament out of context. And he proves that to them over and over. And he tells them to go to the Word and test what's true. Now, he is preaching the Word as given to him by Jesus. He doesn't have a New Testament Bible. He's been given the Word directly from the Lord. That's different from me. I have to have the Word. But he is literally getting it directly from the Lord because he's an apostle. And he warns them, don't get off track. Stay true to the Word. Let the Word be your guide. So that's very good counsel, biblical counsel. Then at verse 7, it winding up tonight's study. For who makes you differ from another? And what do you have that you did not receive? Now, if you did indeed receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it? He's asking a question. Why do you differ? There's some that are on board and there's some that's not. And he's asking the question, why? What's causing the problem? And we understand that there's cliques in every church. And I know you know what a clique is. It's where people, good friends, get together and they form this little group. We got them at Clearwater. And I'm part of some of it. But anyway, the point is that they're their buddies, and they talk things out, and they do things, and that's not necessarily bad. When it becomes bad is when pride enters in. The problem at Corinth wasn't a clique problem. It was a pride problem. They had a problem. Paul was trying to correct them, and rather than being corrected, they said, well, you're not really an apostle. And they began to question his apostolic authority. So when he asked them, how do you differ? It was a pride thing. And there's 3 questions I think he asked. Who makes you different from another? We're all the same in the sight of God. We're all sinners. There's not any of us better than the other one. As I've heard all my life, I put on my pants one leg at a time. We're all the same. And there's no place for superior attitudes or pride. And he asked another question, what do you have that you did not receive? Everything at my house, you might say, well, I worked for it. Yeah, I might have worked for it, but initially God gave it to me. And I've noticed a fella, in fact, Miss Francis, at her funeral, Fred Morrow, he was a speaker, and one eye is completely blind, and the other one he can just see a shadow. So he's practically fully blind. And he made the statement, Jesus called us to shine, not whine. And I was like, wow, if anybody had a reason to whine, it would be Fred. Because I was standing right next to him, and we were talking, and we'd just met. And he turned and said, well, who are you? Are you part of the family? So I had to tell him who I was again till he recognized my voice. I mean, that's how blind the man is. And you say, well, I got out and I did this with my own hands. I worked and I sweat and I shed blood. What if he's like Fred and you can't do it? It's a gift from God that you were able to do it. So what do you have that you didn't receive from the Lord? And the answer is absolutely nothing. God gave it, and he gave it in the form of a gift. And I have to be completely honest. God has been so good to me lately, I wonder, I don't feel deserving. He has just blessed me and my house beyond comprehension. And I don't feel worthy at all. But he has still done it, and I'm grateful. But it's all from God. And these 3 questions in verse 7, I'll leave you with this. It's just a question. Do we really give God all the credit for our salvation? And that's not a trick question. Do you really give him what he really deserves? Do we live in the spirit of humble gratitude? And I can assure you, when this snow hits, I'm going to try to be grateful, but I'm probably going to gripe. It's cold out there. Seeing all that I've received from God, this is the last question I'll leave you with. What can I give him? And I think part of the answer to that question you've already answered. You're sitting in the pew in his house. And let me encourage you to find your place and fill that pew. Because of all the things you can give God, yourself is probably the greatest gift of all.
Probably our biggest downfall is we want to compare ourselves and our hands to someone else. We never compare ourselves to someone lower than we are. We always want to, well, he's got more money or he's got more things than I have, but you never compare yourself to the other side.
That's certainly true, Sam. We always want what somebody else has got. Very true.
Like, why can't I have that same, you know?
Yeah, very true.
And I
That's certainly true.
One of the things that I've noticed, especially here in the last few years, is I can't thank God enough. Amen.
Amen.
I do it every day, but it's never, ever enough.
You're right, Stan. It's never enough. He deserves all the glory. And I think even with myself, and I know many of you, I admire you because you've got years on me, and you get up and you go. But even at my 65, I've got aches and pains I've never known before. I can't imagine what some of you guys have. Yeah, it's getting worse. And you get up and you keep going. I admire you. I'm telling you, I do. I'm not just making that up. You have to keep going. You're right. And to not keep going is kind of you're unappreciative of that gift of God, right? So keep on keeping on. God bless you is my prayer. We'll see you Sunday morning, Lord willing. If we're not iced up. Now, if we're iced up and the roads are bad, hello, I'm Tim Sutton, the pastor of Clearwater Baptist Church. We are a country church with friendly people. Our mission is to reach and teach people for Jesus Christ. We are located on Farm Road 1448 in Scroggins, Texas. We are so glad that you joined us for this live broadcast. Give all the praise to Jesus. Welcome to worship.